Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm not the pragmatist, quiet type, so I'm actually the in-your-face militant atheist type, so my apologies if anyone is offended by that from the start. I think there's been a lot of talk about the importance of secularism in the United States, in the West. I want to focus on the importance of secularism outside of the West and the need to support secularists. The outrage over the assassination attempt on Malala Yousafzai for her defense of girls' education in Pakistan. You've got the mass protests against Islamists in Tunisia for the assassination of a socialist leader there, Chokri Belaid. You've got Amina's topless activism, where she wrote on her body, "My body is not the source of anyone's honor," and also "fuck your morals." She's actually in prison now in Tunisia, facing possibly up to 12 years imprisonment. I've heard she might be leaving soon, so hopefully that's the case. There are also recent protests in Turkey against Islamization and also against Islamic morality. There was a protest of people kissing because they were told on their underground station not to kiss in public. So what young people did was descend on the metro station and started kissing. You've got young people doing the Harlem Shake in Egypt in front of the Muslim Brotherhood headquarters. And the largest protest in Egypt and in contemporary history, 33 million people came out on the streets against the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Yes, the army has stepped in and taken control as a way of suppressing that revolutionary force. But let's not forget that the people came out against Islamism and prior to that against dictatorship. Even if you're not looking, you can still see the immense resistance and dissent that's taking place. In a sense, it's a new period of human development after decades of Islamism, US-led militarism, unbridled free market reign, cultural relativism, and the retreat of all things universal. Today is an era of the 99% movement and revolutions and uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, many of them female-led. Whilst it may sometimes be hard to see, given the perceived so-called gains by Islamists or the army in the region, in fact as counter-revolutionary forces aimed at suppressing those revolutions, the change in era is palpable. Nonetheless, you still have many postmodernist and culturally relativist leftists, liberals, and feminists who remain firmly on the side of the Islamists. Any opposition to Sharia law, which is basically based on the Quran, the Hadith, which are the sayings and actions of Muhammad, Islam's prophet, and Islamic jurisprudence, any opposition to the veil or Islamic misogyny are met with charges of racism, Islamophobia, cultural imperialism, and more. But those who say this have bought into the culturally relativist notion that societies in the Middle East and North Africa, and even the so-called Muslim community right here in the West, are homogeneous, that they're Islamic and conservative. But there is no one homogeneous community anywhere. Since it is those in power that determine the dominant culture, this point of view sees Islamist values and sensibilities, often imposed by brute force, as the values and sensibilities of the so-called authentic Muslim. But as Musa Baderi, who's a professor at one of the oldest Palestinian universities, says, Islamists resort to abuse and threats of physical violence, attempting to appropriate to themselves the sole authority of what Muslims can and cannot think, can and cannot do. There are and will remain as many different Muslims as there are unfettered minds. And he was actually threatened to death because of the cartoons on his door. And for this cartoon in particular, where the man says, "You look gorgeous today, dear," and she says, "I'm here." In fact, Muslims, or those who are labeled as such, include secularists, include atheists, free thinkers, socialists, women's rights campaigners, LGBT campaigners. Even someone like the wonderful Salman Rushdie speaks for Muslims. As writer Hanif Qureshi says, he speaks for their doubts. He speaks the bits of them that they actually think and feel sometimes. Do I really believe in all this stuff? But can't say. Conflating Islamism with Muslim is a narrative that is peddled by Islamists and their apologists in order to feign representation, restrict dissent, and prescribe the limits of acceptable expression. Those who assert that a demand for secularism and opposition to the veil or Sharia law are foreign and culturally inappropriate are only considering Islamism's sensibilities and values, and not of the many who resist. Here's a slide on Taliban marriage counseling, where he asks, "Have you tried throwing rocks at her?" Now, obviously, this shouldn't be surprising. A large young population, a majority, in fact, 70% in Iran are under 30, in the Middle East and North Africa, brings with it challenges to the status quo, as does the recent women-led revolutions and the backlash against Islamism. As 34-year-old Egyptian female cartoonist who drew this, Doa El-Ad says, she calls herself a Muslim anarchist, and she's facing blasphemy charges right now for her political cartoons that poke fun at the Islamists. She says, "The extremists don't scare me. Whatever they do, I will continue to use my skills to poke fun at them. They must understand that we Egyptians have changed with the revolution, and we will not go backwards." In the same way that they are opponents of nude protest and supporters of the veil of Islamism and Sharia in the West, there are also supporters of nude protest and opponents of Sharia and the veil in the so-called East. Even more so, because I think you will not find any greater opposition to Islamism than those who have suffered and lived under it. This has nothing to do with cultural imperialists patronizingly rescuing Muslim women any more than the fight for women's suffrage was a rescue attempt and a form of cultural imperialism. After all, the idea was foreign to begin with and started in one specific place. And here's a poster against the women's suffrage movement, which says women's suffrage would double the irresponsible vote. It's a menace to the home, men's employment, and to all business. Only those who see their rights and lives as separate and different from those who are deemed other and who have bought into or are selling Islamism's narrative can see solidarity and the demand for equality in this warped way. Ironically, like the despicable far right, which despises multiculturalism, yet benefits from its ideas of difference to scapegoat the other and promote its own form of white identity politics, the postmodernist leftists and liberals also use multiculturalism to side with the oppressor by demanding respect and tolerance for difference, no matter how intolerable. Here's a great slide of cultural relativism. It says, "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty by reason of cultural relativism." But as the Algerian sociologist Maryam Namazie says, difference and diversity are double-edged swords. We can never forget that they have been used by reactionary forces to maintain in their difference, often by force, categories of people and categories of population. What lies behind this so-called respect for difference is the deep desire that the so-called other remain different. Defending secularism, free expression and equality, opposing Sharia law, far-right Islamism, and Islamism is our far right, and Islamic states have nothing to do with prejudice against Muslim communities, racism, and Islamophobia. Saying so ignores the immense dissent, including amongst those considered Muslims, and denies the social and political struggles and class politics. Islamophobia, in my view, is a political term that is used to scaremonger people into silence. Charges of Islamophobia have been coined not because anti-Muslim bigotry is their main concern, but in order to protect Islam and Islamism. If they were so concerned about Muslims, or those labeled as such, they would oppose, not support Sharia law and Islamism, and stop justifying Islamic terrorism, which kills more Muslims than anyone else. Don't get me wrong, racism and bigotry exist, but you can't stop prejudice by limiting dissent and free expression, and stopping much needed criticism of Islam and religion, and by siding with Islamic fascism. Here's a great Jesus and Mo cartoon. Jesus says, if we want to live together peacefully in a multicultural society, we must ensure that everyone's fundamental beliefs are protected from attack and ridicule. And the barmaid says, I don't want my fundamental beliefs to be protected from attack or ridicule, thanks. Please do feel free to attack or ridicule them anytime you wish. And there's Muhammad saying, racist, which is quite typical, isn't it? As Women Living Under Muslim Law says, fundamentalist terror is by no means a tool of the poor against the rich, or the third world against the West, of people against capitalism. It is not a legitimate response that can be supported by progressive forces of the world. Its main target is the internal democratic opposition to their theocratic project, and to their project of controlling all aspects of society in the name of religion, including education, the legal system, youth services, and so on. When fundamentalists come to power, they silence poets, musicians, painters. They physically eliminate dissidents, writers, journalists, like fascists do. Like fascists, they physically eliminate the Untermensch, the subhumans, among them the so-called inferior races, gays, mentally or physically disabled people, and they lock women in their place, which, as we know from experience, ends up being in a straitjacket. Here's a slide of the Islamic Republic of Iran saying how, and this is how we handle sassy teenage girls. Of course, when speaking of Islam or any religion, I'm not referring to religion as a personal belief. Everyone has a right to religion and atheism, but Islam today is not a personal matter, but the banner of a political movement, an industry, a mafia, a killing machine. When it comes to religion in the state and law and educational system, then it is no longer a question of personal belief, but of political power and control. Islam, like all religion, but particularly so because of Islamism, or the Islamic Inquisition as I like to call it, should come with a health warning like cigarettes. It kills. Those who equate opposition to religion, the religious right, or religious misogyny with racism and an attack on Muslims, see an attack on misogynist beliefs and movements as an attack on people, which is not the case, and they choose to side with culture and religion over the lives and rights of human beings. This culturally relativist perspective implies that women's liberation is only for those who are white and Western. The rest of us are only allowed freedom within the confines of Islam. Thanks, but no thanks. Islamists use the latest technology to advance their barbarity, but when it comes to women's rights and secularism, they're suddenly Western and foreign. Even if rights are Western, which they are not, they were fought for by progressive social movements and the working class and belong to all humanity. In the topsy-turvy world of cultural relativists, opposing women's subhuman status, defending secularism and the right to criticize religion is on par with joining forces with the far right. It is not. I oppose US-led militarism. That doesn't mean I support the Islamic regime of Iran, or vice versa. I despise both, I oppose both. And I oppose all forms of fascism, not just my own. After all, Islamism is our far right. As the late Mansour Hikmat says, the religious, cultural, ethnic, and national categorization of people is always the first step in denying their universal rights as human beings. If the genocide in Rwanda is the continuation of an African tradition, if stoning is the Iranian people's Islamic tradition, if veiling is part of the culture of women in Islamic societies, if marrying off a 9-year-old girl is a tradition of the people of those countries themselves, then they can really be forgotten, humiliated, bombed, and left to the mercy of their own rules beyond the fortresses of Western civilization and democracy. But if it becomes clear that these people, like all others, live and produce in capitalist society and global markets, if it becomes apparent that these Islamic traditions and laws have been imposed on them by sheer force of imprisonment, torture chambers, street patrols, knives, executions and stonings, if it becomes apparent that these people, like all others, are yearning for freedom, equality, and an end to discrimination, then all this hypocritical ideological monument of cultural relativism will collapse, and the damage will be beyond words. From Egypt to Algeria, from Turkey to Iran, this damage to cultural relativism has been done. And people worldwide are seeing that the demands for freedom and secularism are not Western, but universal. Nothing rings more true today than the chants on the streets of Tehran in 1979 in opposition to compulsory veiling. The chant said, "Neither Eastern nor Western, women's rights are universal, and freedom is our culture." Today we must add, as the philosopher A.C. Grayling says, secularism is our basic human right. And given the bleak realities of Islamism today, it is clearly also a historical task and necessity. Thank you. I guess I'll just take questions. Yeah, yes, please.
Thank you very much. So you're saying that we really can not feel bad about criticizing the culture that we find in the West, that we find abhorrent. We shouldn't feel bad about it because it helps to free these people, free the people? In other words, if we find child marriage and veiling, it's not, we're not being racist against those people, we're really trying to help them. Am I mistaken in how you hear this?
I mean, I think the point I'm trying to make is that there are many people in Egypt or Tunisia or Iran who think just like you. So again, it's not an us and them. Just as there are many people in the United States who are closer to the Islamists than they are to you sitting in this room, though they might be Americans and born in the US. The point is there is no us and them in that sense, that there are many people who are considered Muslim, who are free thinkers and who are at the forefront of fighting against the religious right, very often at great expense to their lives, and with great dangers involved, obviously, given that many of them live in theocracies. Leaving Islam, for example, and saying you're an atheist is punishable by death in 10 countries today, and it is a prosecutable offense in nearly 30 others. And as we speak, there are people who are in prison for their atheism, like Alex An, who has been given a several-year prison sentence in Indonesia. You've got the Bangladeshi bloggers and a death list of more than 80 by the Islamists against them. You've got Imad Habibeddin in Morocco, who started actually one of our councils of ex-Muslims there, who has been threatened and is now in hiding. So it's a very dangerous thing to do. What I want to say, first of all, is that when you speak out, you're not really freeing people, you are standing with them in the sense that many of them agree with you. You know. On the other hand, that's not to say that racism doesn't exist. It does, and I think it's hugely important that we stand up both against Islamism and religion in general, and be able to criticize Islam, but also stand up against the far right in the Western Europe that is using Islam and Sharia law as a way of scapegoating immigrants and Muslims. Groups like Stop Islamization of America, people like Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller, who are virulently racist and anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim. And I think, you know, the point I made, where you can be anti-Islamism but still defend the rights and equality of Muslims. For the far right, they see Muslims as a homogeneous group. They think no Muslim is innocent or moderate, and therefore they blame all Muslims for the crimes of Islamism. And then you've got the lovely left and liberals who defend Islamism by seeing Muslims again as a homogeneous entity, and saying that Islamism defends all Muslims and supports all Muslims. So there's a need to see beyond that and see that there is no homogeneous entity. On the other hand, we mustn't be afraid to speak the truth. You know, I was not black or South African, but I was opposed to racial apartheid in South Africa. You know, very often today we have people telling others that they're not allowed to speak. You're not allowed to speak against Islamism if you're not a Muslim, if you're white, if you're from a Western country. The point is that it doesn't matter what your background is, what your skin color is, what your gender is. If you want to speak the truth, you have to be able to do it. You know, but siding with the many who are doing that already in the Middle East and North Africa and in countries across the West will make it an easier task for those who want to do that. Sorry, I put the wrong picture up. That was the people I was talking about.
It looks like we're coming to a secular or a sectarian war between Shia and Sunni across the Middle East. And I know that's not what you were talking about today in this wonderful presentation you've given. But how can people in the West who have gone through a religious war in Europe between Catholics and Protestants, how can we today make any difference, positive difference, for people caught in the middle of what looks like a terrible sectarian war all across the Middle East?
I mean, I think sectarianism is one problem. US-led militarism is quite another. And even if you look at Islamism as a far-right political movement, it was brought to center stage during the Cold War. And it was, at the time, part of US government foreign policy to create a green belt or an Islamic belt around the Soviet Union at the time. I think it's common knowledge that the US government, for example, funded the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and so on and so forth. I don't think anyone is shocked to hear it. Even in a situation like Iran, which I think is the beginning of contemporary Islamism in, you know, since the from 79 onwards, we've seen a rise of political Islam as a result of an Islamic regime in Iran. That was again something that US foreign policy had a hand in. The revolution in Iran was not an Islamic revolution. And in fact, the powers met at Guadeloupe in a conference to discuss the fact that since the Shah had been overthrown, the best alternative for Iran would be an Islamic one. And, you know, and oftentimes these things sound like conspiracy theories, don't they? But I think you don't need conspiracy theories when politics itself is so dirty and so real, you know. But so, in a sense, I think Islamism, for the people in Iran in particular, and many other places, it has been a force that has been imposed by sheer force. I mean, as a result of Islamism, we have lost an entire generation, as have the people of Algeria and many other places. So in that sense, sectarianism is one problem. I think fundamentally there is a benefit, even today, for Western governments for theocratic and Islamic rules, in the sense that it is a good way of controlling populations in the Middle East and North Africa and preventing revolutions. But I think the only problem Western governments really have is terrorism in its own territories. So you've only really been concerned about Islamism since September 11th, but it has been something that has been terrorizing the populations of the Middle East and North Africa for decades, very often, and still today with US government support and Western government support. So I think that's another aspect to it. I think, we need to, oftentimes when I say we need to show solidarity, people will say, but, our governments are so horrible, and, and I always say, well, I'm not really talking about government support. I wouldn't trust the US to do anything positive anywhere, I'm sorry, nor would I trust the Iranian regime to do anything positive. But I have a great deal of faith and hope in humanity and our intervention and in being able to stop, and we have done that, haven't we? We have examples of many things that have changed throughout history as a result of human solidarity and intervention, and putting so much pressure that even governments that supported, for example, the racist regime in South Africa had to back down. We no longer have racial apartheid, which is a huge, huge success for humanity. And in a sense, I think that sort of solidarity is crucial. For many of us, even the Islamists very often work together. They have Islamic organizations in the West where Sunnis and Shias are there, and they will work together to combat atheism, to combat blasphemy, to combat apostasy, to combat any sort of free thinking. And in that sense, people as well very often work together in order to fight them. And we need to be able to work more closely with secularists in the region. It's never been more clear how much people don't want Islamism than in the past few years. It's very clear, it's clear as daylight. Nonetheless, we have large numbers of secularists in the West constantly concerned about Islamophobia, racism, about whether it would be, how it would be looked at, and so on and so forth, rather than doing what every good secularist should do, which is showing solidarity with people in the region. For me personally, I think the fight is against Islamism, even though I hate all religions. And as I said, they should come with health warnings. But nonetheless, I think, it's like Christianity during the Inquisition to one today. I know it's quite horrible in the US as well, with the Christian right. But again, it's a clear example of what happens when religion has political power. And I think if we can get rid of Islamism and stop the support it's receiving from Western governments, for one. Yes, the US doesn't like, Al-Qaeda, but it has very cozy relations with Saudi Arabia, which is, one of the major Islamic states in the world. It has fought a war in Iraq, which has massacred so many people, and now Iraq is more Islamic than it was during Saddam Hussein, which it supported. So in that sense, I think, we need to look at government policies and what they're doing, put pressure, and speak out loudly and vocally for secularists. If you looked at the presentations before, we heard about how things had changed in the United States since the late 70s, early 80s. Again, you need to see that link with the rise of Islamism, because the rise of the religious right anywhere will help the rise of the religious right everywhere. And it gave power and courage and examples for the Christian right. You have, for example, even the Church, the Vatican, saying in the UN that there is something called Christianity phobia, following on the use of Islamophobia. So they do, and they work together always in every resolution that has to do with reproductive rights, women's rights, gay rights, whatever, anything to do with the human being in the 21st century. the Vatican and the Islamic regime of Iran and the Saudi government, they're all working together. Are we doing the same? I don't think so. Oh, sorry. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a question about the angry atheists who criticize Islam will often go to the far right because especially in Europe, not so much in the U.S. because our religious right has convinced the entire U.S. that the Muslims are a solid bloc, but especially in Europe, where the far right is the only one, seem to be the ones focusing, and I'm not sure how true it is, but they at least say they are standing up for free speech. But how do we of the lefts go, look, we can support these people without making them feel like they have no support from the left?
I mean, I think that's a very good question, and it is a huge problem that I face. I mean, one of the things, because I've been active against the Iranian regime for many decades. Yeah, I'm really old now, so I'm so tired. But one of the things I'm telling my Iranian comrades is that you can't just focus on the Iranian regime now because of the rise of the far right. You've got to also focus against the far right because they're using this issue. And in a sense, Islamism is a far right movement. They're very similar. If you look at the Islamists and, Breivik in Norway that killed all those young people, or, Stop Islamization of America, or, the English Defense League, which Stop Islamization of America loves. You see that very often their tactics and strategies and their fundamentals are really very, very similar. They're very similar. And yes, okay, the EDL hasn't killed as many people. Well, that's because they don't have the political power that will help them do that. And, but their politics are exactly the same, and they've done it when they could, during fascism and so on and so forth. But I think the point is that, the example I gave where if you're opposed to the Iranian regime, it doesn't mean that I want the US to go and attack Iran. But I have to also speak the truth about the Iranian regime. Very often on the left they'll say, well, don't say anything because you will encourage an attack. In fact, I think what you do is humanize the people of Iran and show that many of them are also opposed to the regime, but they also don't want to die under US bombs. And I think in that sense it's important for us to show that things are not so, everything is not in a clear box, that there are many people, there are examples of, I'm sure even in your own families, where you have a million different points of view. I have an Islamist in my family who took bin Laden's picture to school and was expelled as a result, and he was basically raised in Canada thanks to multiculturalism. Then he became a psycho, but because our family is quite secularist actually. But what I want to say is that it's important to show those differences, and why is it that we accept that there are so many differences within the atheists, within the secularists, within even Christians and so on and so forth. But when it comes to Muslims, suddenly it's one block and they all think the same. So I think we have to speak the truth. We have to be able to say Sharia law is an abomination. Islam, like all religions, is, honestly, I think a killing machine. And we're not talking about personal beliefs. But on the other hand, we have to say that, we're doing it to defend secularism, to defend equality and rights, whereas the far right is doing it because they want to defend Christianity, they want to get rid of anyone who doesn't look like them, and they want to actually restrict, they want freedom of expression, but try criticizing Christianity, and it's unacceptable to them. So their freedom is a sort of, the freedoms that Islamists always talk about. Oh, women are so free under Islam, and it's just words. Yeah, but in action we see how different things are. And I think in any political movement you have to judge it not only by what it says, but what it does, where it stands, and who it defends as well, and who it opposes. So you make those judgments on every other political movement, but certainly when it comes to Islam and Sharia law, so everybody seems paralyzed.
Question, how do women in extremely repressive regimes hear about secular values and feminism? Is there like an underground network of pamphlets? Are they on the internet? Are there book discussion groups, rock music? How do they, you know, when people are trying to repress them, put them down, and, you know, keep them at home, how are they finding other ways?
I mean, I think partly, obviously, the world is so different today than it was even, I don't know, 20 years ago. I remember trying to post newsletters that we had typed and printed off, and now you've got the internet, social media. You can hear about Amina's topless activism in a second, whereas before we may never have even heard of her. And so I think in that sense, the world is so small now, isn't it? And people hear about different ideas and different actions all the time. But also, I mean, I think the point is that from my perspective, I think you have a humanist and a socialist and whatever, a free thinker in every person, really. And I think you don't really have to have read a book to know that something is wrong and that you are being violated. You know, if you look at Sharia law, for example, and I'm not talking about the, you know, the brutal criminal aspects of it, where women are still stoned to death, and you know, there's a 16-year-old girl is hung in a city square for acts incompatible with chastity. But I'm talking just about the family code of Sharia law, which is being implemented in Britain, for example, as well, where, you know, you've got it's got to do with a woman losing her child custody at a preset age because religious dogma determines that, you know, the child no longer needs his mother and needs to go to the father. Or the fact that a woman can't get a divorce unless there are very specific reasons, but men have the unilateral right to divorce. Or if you get inheritance, you get half of what boys do. If you go to a court, your testimony is worth half that of a man, so you need 2 women for the testimony of 1 man. That in itself breeds outrage and dissent and opposition, you know. I think it was the example earlier of the earlier speaker who said that she was fired for her atheism and that made her, you know, angry and opposed. And I think that's the same when you're dealing at this level with such oppression. Just to give you one last example of, you know, veiling in Iran, compulsory veiling. I know here in the West it's so fashionable to defend the right to veil and how, you know, the veil is just another form of clothing, blah, 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 blah. Whereas, in fact, you know, the veil is is a tool for restricting and repressing women. It's like the chastity belt. It's like foot binding. It's a mobile prison. It's sort of saying, you know, it signifies and represents sex apartheid. It's not just another form of clothing. It's like racial apartheid, but women and girls from the age of 9 have to wear the tool of separation on their very backs. But if you look at Iran, for example, one of the major problems the regime has is actually trying to enforce the compulsory veiling. And they're constantly setting out directives against women and girls who are improperly veiled. And according to their own statistics, in one city, they arrested 1 million people or fined them for improper veiling. So there's these sort of battles that take place all the time, and we're hearing more and more about them because of social media.
Would you please comment on Ayaan Hirsi Ali and the extent to which she is empowering Islamic women in the West, and whether she's being used by the American Enterprise Institute?
I mean, obviously, I think everybody has a right to be active in any way they want. Some people may not like the way I choose to speak or do things, and I think that is the wonderfulness of freedom of expression. It is mine, thank you very much, I'll do it the way I like, whether you like it or not. And you are free to oppose it. I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a very brave person. She has done a tremendous amount of work in opposing Islamism and criticizing Islam. I think, though, her criticism is very much within the framework of a very right-wing criticism of Islam and Islamism, in the sense that she often speaks about immigrants bringing in the Islamic culture, whereas in fact many of immigrants, I myself included, herself included, are people who have fought against Islamism and Islam. Again, she too often portrays Muslims as a homogeneous bloc. And also the fact that she works with, you know, a neoconservative think tank. And not so recently, but, you know, she said something about how she thought if it's difficult for Muslim women to become an atheist, then they should become Christians because it's a nicer religion sort of thing. And again, I think, you know, well, if you're capable of being an atheist and I'm capable of being an atheist, I think the poor little Muslim woman can also be capable of being an atheist if she wanted to be. And I think in that sense, you know, there are vast differences. And again, I don't think, just as the Muslim community is not homogeneous, the ex-Muslim community is not homogeneous. There are many ex-Muslim groups out there that are virulently racist and work with the far right. And there are others, like our councils of ex-Muslims, which has been established in several countries worldwide, that defend secularism, that defend the right to religion and atheism, but demand a strict separation of religion from the state and so on.
We've got 2 more questions queued up, and then we're going to go on to the next speaker.
I may be mistaken, but the late Christopher Hitchens used to use the term Islamofascism, which was picked up by a number of speakers. Is that a fair term or correct term at all, in your opinion?
Yes.
Hi, could you comment a little bit about taqiyya, which from what I understand is Islam's condoning denying your faith in order to, I guess, get your foot in the door?
Yeah, I mean, I think very often this is something that you hear from the far right, and I'm not saying any of us are saying that, but they use that as an excuse to justify why all Muslims, and even some of us ex-Muslims, are actually, you know, lying, and we're all there to defend Islam and Islamism, because Islam allows for you to lie if you can somehow get in and then plant a bomb somewhere or do something. So, I mean, you know, Muslims are people just like everybody else, you know, so like many Christians, many of them may not have read even the Quran, just like many Christians may not have even read the Bible. They pick and choose as they like many Christians do. They're just normal people who may drink and have girlfriends and boyfriends and do many of the things that are not permissible in the Quran. You know, so I think, in a sense, it's such a, you know, very black and white view of Muslims by saying, well, the Quran says this, so you really can't trust any of them Muslims, you know, we've got to get them all out of here, sort of thing. And my father's a Muslim, many of my family are Muslims, they hate Islamism, they despise it. And many of them are in the West because they have fled Islamic regimes and states. You know, so in that sense, I think you should take those things with a pinch of salt. What we need to say is Muslims are like everyone else. They're not a homogeneous group. They have a million different beliefs amongst them. Many of them are labeled Muslim even though they hate Islam and they hate being Muslim, and they are atheists. There are many people in the Council of Ex-Muslims who still go to the mosque, who wear the burqa, who pray 5 times a day because they have to for a variety of reasons. They are closet atheists. So, you know, even seeing a veiled woman on the street does not necessarily mean she's your enemy. She might be forced to wear the veil, she might even choose to wear the veil, but she might still be opposed to Islamism and be the greatest defender of secularism. We need to look beyond this very narrow blinkers that we have about Muslims and immigrants and realize that many of them are our allies, just like there are many white Americans who are not your allies because they are defending the religious right. It's the same thing. Thank you.